I think we're ready, so let's begin. Hi everyone, my name is Sally Fay. I am of Australian descent with shoulder-length copper red hair, wearing a blue top and rather large glasses. My personal pronouns are she and her. I'd like to start today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, people that are here with us today, and I'm personally coming to you from Palava country. I extend those same respects to First Nations people across Australia and New Zealand, and in particular wherever you might be joining us from today. To our whānau in New Zealand, kia ora. I acknowledge the Maori people of Aotearoa and their role as kitiaraki for the people, the land, the environment and the inhabitants. I also extend my respects to their kaumatia, past, present and emerging. My role at Microsoft is a global specialist in our Asia modern work team. I focus on the unique needs and challenges of those working in frontline roles. These people are known by many terms. We call them team members, crew members, customer service associates, clinicians, plant operators, distribution specialists, drivers, call centre agents, orderlies, nurses, housekeeping, attendants. I could go on. But these are the ones that are really responsible for producing our products and services and delivering them to our customers. Every organisation has a frontline and many actually have multiple frontline personas. Today, I'm here as your moderator for our Masterclass, The War for Talent, Engaging and Upskilling Employees in a Hybrid Work World. I invite you to engage with us throughout this session. Raise your questions in the Q&A chat as we go along and we'll endeavour to answer them for you. The COVID pandemic has had a profound impact on our lives and workplaces, easily having been the biggest global disruption any of us have experienced in our lives to date. We've had over 18 months of continual disruptions, lockdowns, closures, reopenings, more closures. The impact of these disruptions have been many and varied, and we continue to experience them today. Many organisations have had to stand down or furlough staff, close stores and operations, reorganise supply chains, and reinvent business processes, often on the fly. And we're now seeing labour shortages in some industries, compounded by our closed borders, be they state or international. Our need to be agile, responsive and communicate effectively is acutely in focus. These impacts from the pandemic disruption have been acutely felt by our colleagues in frontline roles. While many of us have worked from home and the challenges that we've endured in being able to establish that, many of our frontline colleagues' workplaces have been closed or they've had to operate under very different conditions, many that have had a direct or even negative impact on their very well-being. These disruptions have been effective at highlighting weak links in our communication channels in particular. For example, pre-pandemic, many organisations relied heavily on verbal cascading of information and messaging through chains of command or through physical assets in shared spaces. Methods that don't fit COVID-safe operating guidelines of today. And if we're honest with ourselves, they're not the most effective at engaging employees and maintaining the integrity of messages that are being transmitted either. It's also had an impact on the need for learning and skilling. For example, new processes need to be effectively communicated so employees can work within them. How organisations deliver training and learning has been compounded by the pandemic, both in the method of delivery and the demand for it. For organisations that have had to stand down employees due to closures, they're now facing uphill battles to reskill employees as they ramp back up to openings. In our new world of hybrid working, we're at an inflection point. There's an author, his name's Jay Samit, and I think he really captured this opportunity well when he said that pivoting is not the end of the disruption process, but the beginning of the next leg of your journey. In today's masterclass, we want to embark on that next leg of the journey. I'm joined today by two very knowledgeable and passionate advocates in these fields, and together we'll explore the impacts I've spoken about and how we can respond to these. You'll have the opportunity to hear from them as to what they're seeing and hearing and learn what new opportunities these impacts present for us to iterate on, particularly on how we engage and upskill our workforce. So let's dive in. Carly, let's start with you. Could you start us off by introducing yourself and talking a little bit about your role at Microsoft?
Sure. Thank you for the introduction, Sally, and hi, everybody. Thank you for having me here today. My name is Carly Scott Murphy. I am of Australian descent with shoulder-length brown hair. I'm wearing my trademark red today, as the joke was going earlier on today. I've got a red shirt with my trademark red lipstick, and I'm wearing green rimmed glasses at the moment on my face, but sometimes they do pop onto my head during the conversation. My pronouns are she and her. My role here at Microsoft, very much like Sally, I'm part of our modern work global specialist team, and my specialisation area is in the employee experience or through Microsoft Viva. I come from an HR tech background, so really do bring that deep experience in that technology from a people perspective. And love having being here today to be able to share the employee kind of experience a little bit more broadly than the HR perspective. Sal, back to you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kelly, and welcome. Rachel, let's shift to you. Could you introduce yourself to us all and tell us a bit about your role at Engage Squared?
Hi, Sally. Yeah, thanks everyone for having me today. I'm Rachel Hunnett, and I'm the lead for the Digital Workplace and Employee Experience practice at Engage Squared. We're a digital consultancy with a focus on Microsoft 365 technologies, and we work with organisations of varying sizes across multiple industries, so from government departments to hospitality and retail, to energy and resources, education, construction and more. I have a background as a senior consultant, a user experience designer, as well as an organisational change manager. But my role at Engage Squared is focused on ensuring great outcomes for our clients, with a key focus on corporate intranets, Microsoft Viva, and enabling employee experiences with frictionless, intuitive solutions that solve real business solutions. Back to you, Sally.
Fantastic. Thanks, Carly and Rachel. I'm really pleased that you guys can join us today. Kelly, there's been a lot of talk about the Great Reshuffle, the Great Resignation. How do you see this playing out in the Australian market? Are we perhaps a bit more protected, or do you see a spike in resignations as we head into our new normal, if I can call it that?
Yeah, exactly. Look, I'd love to say that we're sort of protected from the Great Resignation or the Great Reshuffle, but in all honesty, we're starting to see resignations already. We're kind of the thinking out there is really that we're going to start seeing a peak of resignations around sort of March 2022 as people come back from their December and January kind of time offs that we see, right? So that period over Christmas, we'll start to see people, like they're doing already, starting to reassess how they live, where they work, how they work, etc. And more importantly, how work really impacts all of that kind of our work-life balance, right? So a lot of people have been kind of hanging around due to the uncertainty of the pandemic. So they'll start to, as we go back out there into the big wide world. I'm coming to you here from Melbourne, Australia. So I've been into the office a big 3 times in the last 2 years. So really, people will start to take that time over Christmas to start thinking about, how, their career decisions and knowing that there'll be a lot more opportunities out there as people start to turn over. And so, we're definitely starting to see that here. I think another component to start thinking about over the last 2 years has definitely been sort of the area of burnout as well, right? So, and that includes across the whole workforce, right? Particularly frontline workers in healthcare. They have done an amazing job. And if I start to think about sort of my last 2 years and then amplify it by about 20,000, that's what I kind of imagine the kind of level of burnout, but the passion that they have to continue to do that job, right? So this burnout will be another kind of component to considering, right? Is the grass greener on the other side? Is it going to be better if I start a new job from fresh? Do I need to work the hours that I need to be doing? Am I going to see all that? So we'll start to see that as another driver. I think around work arrangements too, just more in general, people are prioritising their experiences as what's in a job as well. So they'll look at employers with that lens as well. So for some, money is obviously the key driver. For some who have that capability, we'll start to look at, is this organisation where I want to be, where I want to spend, a whole period of time, and I think we'll talk about it in the discussion around that kind of engagement area. I think, one of the surveys that or research kind of pieces that I was reading in preparation for this was really that 25% of people, surveyed here in Australia are thinking about this, right, across the broad spectrum, right? So not just in kind of that office worker head office perspective, but across the spectrum. And I think, looking at things like border closures, there's been a lot more jobs and a lot more opportunities out there for people to be selective and think, what, I'm not getting what I want at the moment. I'm going to find somewhere that does. So it's really kind of that employee or that talent market rather than the company market out there. I think it's that it goes back to me and to all the research that's out there is really showing things like engagement, connection to purpose, to connection to others, that sense of belonging, connection to leadership, opportunities to learn, right? They're all these drivers that people are starting to consider now, right? As I spend more time at work, as I spend more time there, I want to be connected to something greater. So I think the opportunity to learn here is potentially key, because that, with many, as you mentioned, right, with many workers furloughed or let go, employees are wanting to learn new skills to be able to pivot, right, as roles start to change more quickly. We've seen, right, with the change that we went to online kind of working back at the beginning of the pandemic, right, that need to skill up and change quickly. I think creating that sense of security for employees that they can be prepared for when that next change comes. And I think, sometimes that will mean opportunities elsewhere, right, as I skill myself up to then provide, create a better me for out there in the market. But I think what we need to think about as employers is to start to think about, well, how do we connect things with learning and engagement and mitigate some of this risk of that great reshuffle, right?
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks for sharing, Carly. I think there's some great insights there, and we certainly see some great examples globally where people such as Walmart are starting to use learning as a key differentiator in their value proposition. So I think you've hit some really key points there as well. But Rachel, I know Engage Squared work with a lot of different organisations to help them address a number of those challenges that Carly just spoke about there, and how to really improve the employee experience through technology. So what conversations are you having with your clients that have these deskless workers out there, and how they're actually engaging? So what's some of the thinking behind the solutions that are being built today?
Yeah, look, really those conversations for us are around two key pillars. And the first is how can we enable our frontline workers to take action using better digital experiences? And those conversations are around uncovering those activities or tasks that can be managed or supported or even streamlined using digital or online tools. And the second pillar of conversation is around how can we bring those frontline workers, as Carly was saying, into the fold and then connect them with our company purpose or our values? And then additionally, we're talking to many organisations who continue to struggle with getting news and announcements, even those P1 announcements, to frontline workers in a timely way. But arguably, more importantly, how can we give those frontline workers a voice in real time to be part of that conversation across the organisation?
Thanks, Rachel. I think that's it's really interesting to sort of hear and see some of those things, and really sort of highlights those challenges that sort of exist. But Carly, can you share your perspective on using tools and technology to support employee engagement and particularly culture?
Yeah, I think before I answer that, I think, going back to Rachel's point, I really think, this is a great time for frontline workers, right? They've often been put or set aside to kind of look at later, right, from a technology perspective, particularly, right? And they are they are the blood of the organization, right? They're out there connecting with customers. So we really need to be looking at how we engage, how we look at retaining these important people, because they are, particularly with what's happening with the Great Reshuffle, if we can engage these people and continue engaging them, right? They are the workforce, they are the managers of the future, etc. So I think it's, it's really important to recognize the effort and the impact that we're looking to make in terms of from a technology perspective, and starting to say to people, hey, we really need to bring everybody into the fold. Everybody needs to be connected with purpose and across the organization and with culture. I think if we look at one of the things I mentioned in my introduction, right, is the fact that I'm from an HR background, and one of the things that's really become more obvious to me over time, and particularly more recently with the experience of Microsoft Viva, is around the fact that from an HR perspective, we've often thought about kind of the employee experience in a very blinkered viewpoint. And so, I remember being sort of in that HR technology space and thinking, yeah, the employee experience, it's about how much leave have I got, what rosters am I doing, how can I prove, the leave that's being asked of me. And it's been that very limited kind of or blinkered view. I think what we're recognizing out in the moment is starting to think about the fact that this experience is more than just those critical HR pieces, right? It is about that communication. It is about learning, right? It's about a whole range of experiences, and how can we do this sort of in the flow of as I'm working every day. And so I think we, from an HR perspective, we need to start thinking more broadly about those experiences. And as we look at our HR tech specifically, or go down the path of reviewing our HR kind of portals, etc., is to think about it in the experience or in the broader experience of the employee and what they're doing. Doesn't mean that this is an area for IT either, right? It is about kind of this combination of bringing IT and HR together, really to working together, and also other areas like our comms teams, right? We're talking about connecting with employees, creating that connection with culture, with purpose, etc. Pushing through those P1 announcements, etc. Connecting them all to that the bigger purpose of the organisation. So we really need to think about how we work more broadly with our other peers across the organisation, and to really create that opportunity for engagement, and going back to that, right, that retention, that ability to create that engaged culture and retain people so that we can develop them, we can reap the rewards of the investment we're making in them from a learning perspective, etc. And as I mentioned before, right, if you think about the frontline worker perspective, that first layer of management, it pretty much comes from your frontline workers that are there, right? Those people who've been there on the floor, seen it, done it, knows that experience, right? They could still be at school, or they could be at uni, right, studying for other things. And I think we had this conversation the other day, Sally, just around, IT people within the organisation. They might be doing an IT job, but they've got this connection to the company. They're invested in the culture. They've been invested in from a learning perspective and that support. And so naturally, right, one of the great things about having somebody who's just finished their IT degree coming into that role is they have that wealth of experience and that networks that allows them to do their roles, right? So it really becomes critical as you think about this employee experience, right? This how important that engagement is. So if we think about it from a Microsoft perspective, then if we look at Microsoft Viva, the reason why we're looking at this, and this goes broadly across the employee experience, is really about trying to create that employee experience. And so we've established that category, and with Microsoft Viva, bringing in modules like Viva Connections that start to look at how can we create those moments, right? When I start my day, I go in and I quickly grab those snippets of news. I go in and see some Yammer conversations where my leadership are making an announcement, and I have the ability to quickly go in and comment, right? It's not lost in, I don't need to go into the Yammer full-blown module, but it's creating that snackable versions and that personalized view for me as a frontline worker in the retail space, right? As opposed to somebody in IT where I might have a different set of news coming at me. Right, so it's really around creating that culture. And I think if we look at one of the other key modules that's relevant to this discussion, I mean, all of them are, but I think, you know, the two key ones are Viva Connections and Viva Learning. And we announced that, which was super exciting, that went general availability a couple of weeks ago. So really super excited about that. But really what we're looking at here is that in experience from a learning perspective, right? So bringing that content together in that personalized learning content in the flow of work. And actually, I was speaking with somebody earlier today about that content, right? And we're not just talking about things like LinkedIn content, but we're talking about things like Go One content, which has that specialization in that frontline kind of area, and bringing together all of these, you know, your learning management content, your third party content that's specialized in, you know, if you're on the shop floor and have to do those kind of trainings versus if you're on the retail floor, right, customer service trainings. How do we bring that all together and create that really kind of like that move towards that more pull culture in learning? How do I want to engage with learning and create that culture of learning rather than just here you go, here's the required training, go off and do that kind of culture?
Yeah, I think you've hit some really core points there, and there's certainly things that I'm consistently hearing when I'm engaging, and particularly around frontline. There's sort of the link to succession planning and identifying talent and nurturing that through the organisation, and that's such a really key component for many of our organisations when they're looking at how do they continue to grow. You know, the innovation from the frontline, the people that actually are there doing the work and understand both the challenges but the opportunities for how those things come through, and that ability to actually connect people into the organisation becomes really important. And you've touched on connections, and perhaps this is one for Rachel, because one of the classic challenges when we have that conversation with organisations is how do they make the content available? How do they engage people in the conversations, and how do they, you know, use the telemetry that becomes available to sort of identify who's engaged and who's interested? And you know, that I think is an important feeder into those succession plans. So that challenge of building, not just building the intranets, but making them available. Historically, this has been a huge challenge for a lot of organisations to be able to deploy to roles outside, you know, the sort of four walls of the office environment. So maybe, Rachel, could you elaborate for us on or some of the insights how organisations can use tools like Viva Connections to really improve that engagement and build that personalised experience?
Yeah, absolutely, Sally. Before I do that, though, I'm just going to share my screen and do a quick little talk about what Connections actually is for anyone who's new to Connections. So essentially, Connections is kind of like a gateway to your modern employee experience, and presenting your intranet via Microsoft Teams. And that's really, at its most basic thing, what Connections does. It presents your modern SharePoint Online intranet within Microsoft Teams, but it's actually so much more. Connections, and you can see the mobile version video playing there, but Connections brings your company news and announcements, social chats and digital tools into the place where most of us are working, Microsoft Teams. But if you add to this the mobile experience, then things start to get really interesting, particularly when we're talking about frontline workers, Sally. And while the mobile view doesn't show your intranet homepage, what it does show is this targeted dashboard of tasks or actions that users often need or want to do. And it also delivers this aggregated view of news and conversations and announcements and company events so that you're always in the know. But in addition to news and resources, Connections gives you this personalised dashboard. And this goes back to some of that personalisation that Carly touched on. The dashboard really is intended as a single destination for all the helpful company resources and tools that you might need as an employee. Things like health checks, leave requests, tasks, pretty much anything else. And the opportunities here really are limitless, especially what you can do when you're building your custom cards or using those out-of-the-box cards to integrate with your own line of business systems or custom content from across your digital workplace, including things like resources for wellbeing and learning. And this is how we're bringing together the full suite of Viva modules. But for me, the coolest part about connections and the most important part of connections for frontline workers is this dashboard targeting. Viva connections can be customised for different roles or audiences. And this means that connections could be configured to show things like shifts or COVID check-ins for your frontline workers and to-dos and headspace cards for your knowledge or corporate workers. So connections is giving me this single pane of glass through which to view my digital workplace, and it's making it easier and frictionless to do tasks and to take actions. But Sally, you asked me to elaborate or to share some insights on how organisations are using Viva to improve engagement. And my answer is twofold, but based around that same concept of personalisation. We are all time poor, knowledge and frontline workers alike. But if you're standing in front of a client, trawling through information, looking for that one piece of information that you need, the requirement for the right information at the right time is exacerbated. And so on one hand, we're working with organisations to configure Viva Connections dashboard with cards that are targeted to different frontline worker audiences. So Sydney versus Melbourne, or in the store versus in the stockroom. And really the outcome here is giving the frontline workers easy access to take action or to connect them with the digital tools from their intranet homepage or Teams on their mobile. And the key thing that these organisations are doing is they're talking to their frontline worker audiences. So they're spending time understanding their needs. They're uncovering the tasks that they undertake and understanding them in a really meaningful way. And then we're translating that into things like user journeys or day of the lifestyle articulations that we're using then as a basis to identify how we might want to configure the dashboard cards for these audiences. But we're also using that same audience targeting to put the right news and announcements in front of the frontline worker audiences using that aggregated newsfeed. And we're working with comms teams around evolving how they share their news, because often frontline worker audience doesn't have time to be sitting there reading long news articles when they're in the moment, or there might be language or literacy challenges, and that means that the messages are getting lost or easily misinterpreted. So a number of the organisations we're working with are starting to use things like video or video bites to share information. And that might be the CEO video, so that we're showing our frontline workers just how passionate the CEO is about our mission. Or it could be the head of risk and safety sharing a video of a hazard, including the instructions for how to avoid the hazard. And they're publishing this media to their intranets and connections via stream, and they're getting far more meaningful, broad reach, particularly with frontline workers. And then because we've got all these social features, the organisations are seeing their frontline worker audience liking and commenting on their videos in ways they've not seen before. They're tagging other frontline workers and they're sharing the content. And because those frontline workers are getting more comfortable with interacting in this way, we're seeing a real shift in social connection and a real, I guess, deepening of that connection to each other and back to the organisation and that deeper sense of belonging. It's an interesting shift.
And I like it, just to add to there, I love the kind of feeling of the kind of social media kind of feeds that come through, right? So this is what, the majority of people are already experiencing, kind of like that news feed through Instagram or things like that are sharing that video content, and we're bringing that into this experience, right? So it's not it's a new way of sharing that news from a corporate perspective, but it is really like an existing kind of capability or skill, right? It's not something I need to learn or change. I'm used to kind of swiping through the news feed and quickly getting that snackable video content. So it's really, it's really great kind of way of thinking about this whole new experience in terms of communicating with employees and connecting them to the culture of the organization.
Yeah, no, I love it. And it addresses so many of the challenges that I get presented with, which have, again, been compounded in the time of the pandemic, which is so many of those traditional chains of communication, which have been either verbal or relied upon very static print style communications. It's really presenting an opportunity to really rethink the way organisations are trying to engage frontline workers. And as you hit on there, Rachel, you know, some of the really key kind of points that this also helps overcome are those challenges around language and literacy and accessibility of information, because, you know, that's a huge challenge too, depending on environments. You know, we encounter a lot of disability in that environment as well, be it hidden or situational. And I think new communication tools and really rich storytelling, I think, is really helping bridge a lot of those. So some fantastic insights coming out of that way, so we can really help people engage in methods that they haven't had previously. So I think it's fantastic. But if we think along that same kind of vein of different insights and sharing about what's coming, Carly, if we think again to the importance of skilling for future, and you've spoken about this, why it's so important to be skilling and continuing to evolve organisations, really interested to hear from you the insights that's coming from the research and the studies. You know, this part's always fascinating. So what are the trends that we're seeing in learning, particularly for frontline, and how we're seeing customers embrace this idea of skilling for the future?
Yeah, I think, you know, it's been a big learning curve for us all, right, in the last 2 years, and thinking about how quickly we needed to pivot overnight from our old training styles, right, from kind of that instructor-led training to kind of how do we share when we're you know out there on site, how do we create more experiences, right, to start to think about that. From a frontline worker perspective, but I think across the board, right? How do we think about learning in a whole new different way? And how do we, you know, create, as I mentioned, right? How do we connect them to learning and to that culture and comms? So it's really important that we start to think about that, creating that culture of learning, right? And it is for that, you know, if we start to look at kind of that skilling for the future and how quickly we've needed to pivot in the last 2 years, I think it's really important that as organisations, both from an engagement perspective, but also for, you know, shoring us up for the future, is really thinking about how do we create a culture of learning so that employees can pivot into new roles, and we do have people there for us when we need to have people in there, right? It is, as I said, it is pretty much that war for talent kind of, you know, it's been around for years, but I think, you know, in the coming year or so, we're going to see it really intensify, just because of the fact that there will be so many people out there changing. And so really, you know, as I mentioned before, one of the changes we're seeing is, right, starting to think about how do we, not necessarily a big change, because we've kind of focused on that, but more of a focus on how do we create and develop those skills internally so that we have those succession plans like you mentioned, right? And that is even more so from that frontline worker perspective. You know, organizations that actually look at this and create that learning culture, create that engagement, as I mentioned, will you know, capture those hearts and minds of employees, right? Create that sense of belonging, create that connection to purpose, the opportunity to discover new learning, right? So it's not just about, hey, Sally, we want you to go into this role, here's the learning pathway, but Sally, you wanting to go off and say, hey, you know what, I think I'm going to explore this like 20-minute content and see if this is something I want to do. You know, it's not just about doing these full day courses anymore. It's really changing that to that snackable learning content. How can we do that in the flow of work, right? And really create that really need or want to go and learn, right? Because it's important for my career, but it's also important for us as employers to think about, you know, how do we skill up those people so that we've got that skill set there, right? It is so important. If you think about the work that you know, work like Microsoft are doing around kind of some of the technology training we're offering, we recognize that there is a need, and we're helping out our customers to really, you know, to skill up those people, to be there to support them, you know, for that future technology. So I think it's really important to think about, right? And as I mentioned, just the changes in moving away from that instructor-led training. I think that's one of the big things that I'm hearing out there with the learning teams is how do we pivot our courses and our training content to really create those learning moments and not just do one bulk bit of training. I mean, that's still, you know, it's still a possibility, capability and still there, but we need to think about these new ways of doing that, right? And as I mentioned before, that just bringing that that pull kind of learning culture rather than just that push, right? And that's what's going to give us that competitive edge. And I think, if we start to look at, one of our work trend index report, one of the things that was talking about was that importance of connecting with people, particularly, that Generation Z, and not just the connections, but having those authentic conversations, right? So if we think about going back to that connection piece, one of the trends and things that we need to think about is how do we look at how that generation consumes knowledge, right? They're the social media kind of generation. They've grown up on this. We need to start thinking about how do we bring that into how we're looking at. And when we do that, right, we're going to build that engagement. We're going to build that workforce of the future, right? Which is going to be super important for our productivity, our success of our organizations as we move into the future.
I think there's you've raised some fantastic points there, Caroline. There's a lot to sort of take in, but what I'm hearing is that there's a real trend towards upskilling, but in the process of bite-sized chunks. So very much this concept of learning in the flow of work, which I think mimics the way we as adults learn. I know, speaking from my own personal experience, my days of being able to sit in a room, take in a whole lot of content for a week on end and remember it in 3 months' time when I actually need to use it, I think are well behind me. But that knowing that I can find the knowledge when I need to be able to do something, that's my learning superpower. I know how to learn, as opposed to just retain copious amounts of information. But those sort of points to take.
Actually, I'll just add to that, and we haven't really kind of dived into Viva Topics or and other modules within that. But Viva Topics, to your point, right, is really around creating the ability to, traditionally we've thought about, I need something, I search for something, right? That is traditional way of thinking. With topics, we're really turning that on its head and thinking, well, how can we bring in that information to you when you need it, as you need it, right? And so this is, I won't dive into it deeply, but it is something that we need to think about as organizations. So to our frontline workers, how do we bring that knowledge to them, rather than them having to go and search for it as well? So a whole other conversation we can have, but yeah, it's really, thinking about this employee experience differently. Sorry to interrupt there.
No. It's a really valid point, because I think it reflects that our work styles are changing, and therefore, the conversation we're having about how do we get information out, our styles and where we work and how we work. And I think it's very much an evolutionary process. And I think some of those kind of points that you've raised really highlight the importance of learning, not just because of what we've been through, but as we look at how do we sustain some of the really good things that have come out of the process. That link to learning, I think, becomes super important for us as well. Succession planning and keeping people engaged and giving that sort of sense of connectedness and purpose with the work that they're doing. But also as we look forward to what are the skills that we need for the future as more and more things become automated, that challenges us with different things that we're going to need to tap into the things that only humans can do. So I think it opens up a whole lot of opportunities for us. And I think to that point, Microsoft have recently announced Viva Learning, and you might have heard Carly speak about this, and it's become generally available. But Carly, could you perhaps share with us a bit more about what is Viva Learning and what type of benefits can people expect to get from this new sort of learning style experience?
Yeah, look, it is super exciting. And I think, out of all the modules and obviously coming from that HR background, I think this is something I've been waiting for since we kind of announced that we were working on it, right? And we have it here at Microsoft. We're using it, and we're connected with our SuccessFactors platform and content that's coming from a variety of different places. But really, in terms of this experience, what we're thinking about here is if everybody kind of thinks about their learning experience currently, what I'm pretty sure a majority of the audience who are watching here would be experiencing is I go to, probably my learning is emailed to me and said, hey, you've got this course that you need to complete that's required by the 30th of November, right? You need to go and do that now. Come on, you haven't done it yet. Come on, haven't you done it? Okay, right, I'm going to go ahead and do that, right? So there's that push, there's that kind of push learning that's happening. If I know, my manager might be talking to me about it, I've got my learning management system over here with an experience. And then the organization might have invested in various content from other places, right? So one of the things here at Microsoft, I didn't realize we actually had a Microsoft library of books that I could learn from and read, right? And so one of the great things about this experience through Viva Learning that I've had is the fact that not only can I access in one place in the flow of my work, which is within Teams, I can go and find out, go and see my content that I need to learn, that I need to do in terms of our standards of business conduct, things like that we need to learn. But also, I've just typed in, I'm interested in change management in the algorithm, and the algorithms, or sorry, not in the algorithm, in my interests, and the algorithm's presenting me with things like books. And I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. I didn't realize that content was there, right? And so it's bringing together, this investment as learning, people in learning. We've gone off, invested in all of this content in a variety of different places, but that experience has kind of been challenged. How do we bring it all together? And I think this is what we're, with Viva Learning, we're bringing those experiences together, but on top of that, we're bringing things into the flow of work. So for example, I have a project team that I run, and in that project team, so a Teams channel, I have a tab up there which is connected to Viva Learning, and I've created my own little learning course content that anybody who joins that team, the first thing that they need to go and do is they go into that tab and they go and consume the courses that I've pinned as sort of that important things. I also share it through the chat. So if somebody's asked me, hey, where do I start with Viva? How do I find that out? I'm like, okay, in the little line below, I'll click Viva Learning and I'll share that content, right? So we're creating those micro learning moments. We're creating the ability to share that content. That learning content will come up across the Microsoft 365 platform. So if we look at things like topics, and we'll have that learning connected to topics, we'll have in that search capability, as you type in, I'm looking for change management, well, one of those courses will pop up. Well, those courses will pop up. So the idea is we're creating an experience for learning, not just let's go and do learning, but how can we create that better experience in terms of sharing and engaging with that content as well, and being able to share from a manager perspective, right, without having to go to our learning and development team and saying, hey, can you create a learning pathway for this, right? We've got this easy flow to be able to share that content. So it's really I'm really excited about it. And, for those on the call, you can go and try out the version that you should have. Your IT team, you might need to reach out to your IT team to make sure it's enabled, but you have the capability to experience kind of that level without connecting through to your learning management systems and your third-party content. But you can start to connect to LinkedIn content and Microsoft content and experience the joy of learning again through that.
I love that, the joy of learning. I'm going to continue. I've got another couple of questions for both Rachel and Carly, but it's a great time if you're listening in here. If you've got any questions, we're going to come to the Q&A shortly. So please go ahead and pop your questions into the chat. If you've got something that either Rachel or Carly have touched on that you'd like to know more about, feel free to go ahead and pop those questions in now, because we'll come to those questions in a moment. But before we do, Rachel, listening to all of this, there's so much that it can happen now from the perspective of content and learning and experiences, not just for people that work in sort of the office environments, but we're really starting to extend that out into the new frontiers of places where people don't sit at computers all the time, which has been that sort of challenging environment, I think, forever for many of us. But what is sort of, I guess, the opportunities for people to become overwhelmed with where do I start, or what could this actually be? So what would you, I guess, suggest to people? How can you actually help them if they're wanting to get started on this path of connections and or learning and be thinking about these new ways of engaging?
Yeah, that's a really great question, actually, Sally. And we work with a lot of teams that are feeling overwhelmed. They're kind of stunned into inaction and they're not really sure where to start, because the word employee experience can encompass so much. But really, the advice that we're giving to our clients at the moment is don't overthink it. Let's not try and boil the ocean. We can eat this, for want of yet another platitude. We can eat the elephant one bite at a time. But I feel like I want to do something really practical. So I'm going to share my screen and just take you through some of the really basic planning steps that we go through for connections, for planning a connection dashboard. So like just as you would design your intranet homepage, spend some time up front strategizing and designing your dashboard. And when you're doing that, start by identifying your audiences. And sure, while targeting dashboard cards to different audiences isn't a prerequisite, it's going to make it a richer experience for your users. So on this screen that I've shared with you, I've popped a really rudimentary, very ugly table on this slide, and I deliberately didn't style this up because it's all about planning. I don't want you to overthink it. In this example, I've chosen 3 audiences: exec, Sydney Ops, Melbourne Outdoor Team, and I've called out where there are some AAD groups that already exist that I can use. I've called out who the audience owners are or the key contact, because we should always have an owner, and I've articulated the content or the activity priorities for each of the audiences, and I have here identified if it's a frontline worker audience or not. So we've got these audiences, so how do we then plan for cards? Well, on this slide, again, a very ugly table, because it's a plan, not a design, I've laid out each audience, and then I've translated those priorities into ideas for cards. One more ugly slide for you, because I've laid out each of those audience targeted cards for each audience, and I've actually included an extra audience in here for new starters because I wanted to, and then I've gone through and I've thought about, well, which cards are going to go where and what type of cards do I think I'm going to need. Is it low code, out of the box, or custom? And so by simply laying this out, you've really got your first steps for planning those audience targeted dashboards. And then lastly, there are some templates that we get from Microsoft to get you started when you're designing your cards. So you can get a feel for each of them in this slide, and some of the proper use cases. And really our recommendation at the moment is having a mixture of these in your implementation will give you a much more engaging or visibly enticing experience. And that's pretty much the basic process that we're going through when we're starting to plan dashboards. It's really about one step at a time and identifying those audiences, because that's the key here, particularly when designing for frontline workers.
And it's that one step at a time, but it starts with really identifying, who are actually the people at the start of this, because
and what do they want to do?
Yeah. Carly, could you, one last sort of question, and we're going to come to the audience questions, so please keep putting those into the chat. I can see we've started to have some come through, but what advice would you have for organisations who are interested in using technology to be able to better support an employee experience?
Yeah, so I think, look, you've got a great team of people here to reach out to. So, please feel free to reach out to any of us, Sally, Rachel, myself, who are on the call, or indeed your internal IT teams, as I mentioned before, going to start that experience and leveraging the technology that you already own, and starting that first step, right, as Rachel said, right, that first bite of the elephant from a learning perspective might be just to start exploring as an L&D team that kind of learning content, and then kind of expanding out from there. So chatting with your IT team as well. I think the areas of Viva, right, you've got the personal insights that you can experience quite easily, and then Viva Connections, as Rachel was mentioning, a little bit more extra work in terms of that one, but in terms of that again is value that you already have as part of your licenses. We encourage you to explore that. There are opportunities to test out kind of the more advanced functionality as well. So definitely reach out to your Microsoft account team. For those of you who aren't part of IT, again, you can reach out to the likes of us on the call, or to Engage Squared, who are here to support you as well. They're very well connected, and we can help connect you up and take you through kind of those deeper capabilities and showcase, the capabilities that can help you connect and engage with your workforce and help them learn. So yeah, I think you've got some great resources on the call. I think, yeah, go out and start exploring some of that functionality that's already there, and start that one step or that one bite of that elephant that way.
Yeah, thanks, Carly. We're going to move now to some of the questions. I think some great advice there, but the questions that have started to come in from yourselves that are listening, so feel free to continue those questions. But I really like this first one that's come in, and it's one that we do hear from time to time. I'm going to paraphrase it a bit, and Rachel, I think it's a question for you, which is sometimes when organisations start to think about enabling everyone on their front line, they can become a little bit concerned about, well, hang on, what is it that they're actually going to have access to, and can find that a little bit confronting, a bit challenging to think about, how open are their digital platforms going to be. So how are you having this conversation and addressing those concerns with organisations when they raise this one?
Again, Sally, my answer is twofold. I seem to have a answer for all your questions. But the first is really discussing security trimming and permissions across Microsoft 365, in that, all connections and learning and topics, they all respect the existing permissions and security management that are in place. And so opening up from a security perspective should be relatively straightforward, assuming that you're following all the appropriate security and permissioning across your content. But the idea of frightening people by giving them this enormous employee experience it's really arguably the most important part of your planning, and that is how you're going to manage that adoption and change management. Because often on the front line, when we're rolling out something like connections or learning, this is their first foray sometimes into your organizational digital workplace, and it's something that needs to be managed. You've got to help them to understand what is in it for them, and potentially consider a staged rollout so that we are helping them to, again, we're talking about eating elephants, but to take their own bites of the elephant at a pace that will work for them, because the same pace of rollout won't work across all frontline audiences, and supporting them. And really an opportunity to take advantage of learning is to include the learning around how do you as a frontline worker audience interact with this new digital workplace connections through modules that you add into learning as snackable bites for just how do you use our digital workplace. I feel like it's twofold, the communication and the training to support them through taking on the new experience. Does that kind of answer your question, Michael, or do you have more that you wanted to ask?
As Michael types his response, I think, assuming you're typing a response, Michael, I think, yeah, look, change management is even more critical these days, right? If we start to think about the speed of what we're doing and the technology capability, but along with, what we're trying to build from Microsoft perspective is something that doesn't require like, a 2-hour training session to be able to use, right? The intuitiveness of that experience is there, and right, you don't need to. The idea is you don't need to come in and scroll through absolutely everything and consume everything, but it's like, I've got a moment, I'll come in and I'll read this news one, or I've got to come in and I've got to, click on one of those cards to then, create my leave request, right? And so that experience is there, but definitely, that idea of building intuitive technologies that are, really relevant, or sorry, really similar to technologies like Instagram, etc., which are already kind of being used. I think that then helps the frontline worker really feel less overwhelmed by that. But yeah, going back to your point, I think that change management is super critical with anything you do around that employee experience, because doing that, you'll get more value and more, more use of the technology than if you just threw it out there, right? So that, what is it in there? What is it? What's in it for the employee? Why? How are they going to be benefiting from it? If you start with that message, and then work from there, you'll have the uptake. And I love Rachel's viewpoint, right? If we start with a cohort, what I've seen in great change management, you start with a cohort and it's this viral kind of adoption, pardon the pun, hopefully we're kind of well enough into the pandemic to use that, but this idea of this viral kind of adoption of that technology because people are using it, it's easy to use, people talk about it, and then create that response there and that rollout.
I also feel, Carly, that when going back to your point about it being intuitive, I also feel like the personalization of how you roll it out, it takes out all the guff, particularly for frontline workers, because they're not there to roam around looking for fun things to read on your intranet. They're there to take an action or to read a specific news item. And so by personalizing that experience, giving them that just in time, the right info at the right time, you're lessening the chance that there'll be that overwhelm because they're getting just what they need at the right time.
Yeah.
Very, very important points, and I do love those. Especially, it always comes down to the adoption and the process that you take.
Every
Got
time.
a question for there's another question coming in, but if you do have any other questions, now's a great time to put them in. But perhaps I'm going to ask you a question in the audience. Maybe use your reactions and give us some feedback on how are you feeling, how have you received the content today. So give us a heart if you just can't wait to go home and try this at home and get started. Give us a thumbs up if you're thinking about it. Maybe the sort of surprise face if you're just a little bit overwhelmed and not really sure where to go. But as we go through, I think Claudia also made a really important point there when she was responding to Michael, which is that there's I think sometimes a tendency in organisations to think, well, there's nothing going on out there. If we're not providing the tools, that it's not happening. And I think we all know that there's a lot of shadow IT happens, particularly in frontline workforces, which actually introduces another element of risk, both from I guess an information protection, privacy, data loss prevention style, very technical aspect, but also to the actual employees themselves. And we see this show up in a couple of ways, be that from unfortunate circumstances that can happen around bullying and harassment, but also sort of sense of engagement and where do people go to actually be informed and feel part of the organisation. So if there's no sort of final questions, maybe just one to yourselves, Rachel and Carly, how are you seeing that aspect of relying on unsanctioned shadow ways for information to be communicated having an impact on culture and engagement?
Yeah, I think the importance of security is, I'm reading articles every day of security breaches and things happening. So it's really important to think about security and how we look at that. And from the Microsoft technology suite, we have, that protection layer and that boundaries around that, and we develop it within that. So when we start to think about that connecting with other products and other modules, Aviva, etc., it's all happening within the framework. We're not having to kind of extract any information to a third party to then be able to do something outside and then, connect, all those integrations in between. So I think it's really important to think about that from, the importance of security these days and what happens when you start to kind of think outside, what IT are doing. The implications of a security breach these days are much more intense than they were, right? Reputational damage, financial damage, business damage across there. So I think it's really, we need to think about as non-IT people is to really respect the IT team's view when they're not necessarily there to stop the project because we don't want you to do that, but there's a reason behind it.
Yeah, fantastic.
I think one question to ask with there, sorry, Sally, is really understanding why the shadow IT is being used in the first place, and then how can we bring them back into our more controlled space so that we can respect our security and regulatory things. It's once we understand why people are using shadow IT, because usually they do it because they see a need and they want to do something, then we can design that experience for them that we're all okay with, including our IT teams.
Yep. No, I think that's a great point and potentially a great segue. And perhaps, Rachel, we're conscious we're right on time at 1 o'clock, and I want to be respectful. I know that in this world of back-to-backs, people likely have other places they need to jump to. But I just want to call out that if you have enjoyed the conversation today, and I want to thank Carly and Rachel for the insights that they've been able to share with us today. I want to thank you for coming. We do have another couple of sessions in a similar vein to this coming up. There's one on Thursday. These have been just designed as discrete conversations, because certainly when we start to talk to organisations like yourselves on the call about how do we engage with our frontline workforces, the next thing that we often find out is people want to do exactly some of these things we've started to touch on. What are those processes and improvements that can actually be made? Where can efficiency be removed from the organisation? And how do we, if we have an opportunity, how do we redesign those processes to actually make the most of the skills and assets that we have available? So we have another session coming up. It's on Thursday, same time, same great opportunity to come along and enjoy an Uber Eats voucher from participating in our calls today, and hear a little bit about what are organisations doing from that operational process and efficiency perspective, and what opportunities exist to sort of gain some efficiency back. And then we have another session next week, which is more designed for a technical audience. It starts to look at, so how do we do this from a very practical sense? What are those steps, tools, processes that exist to actually bring this to life? Because we know that there's a lot happens when the business comes and says, hey, we want everybody out in our stores, sites to be able to start to access technology. That can be overwhelming. So today's been very much a conversation around the people, the engagement, the learning. We have a conversation on Thursday around processes, everything from workforce to workflow management, automation. That's Thursday's topic. And then next week, we're having a conversation around how do we bring this together from a technical perspective. So thanks again. I hope you can join us, or perhaps some of your colleagues can join us on some of those other sessions. And look forward to seeing some of you again in the upcoming masterclasses. So enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Sal. Thanks, Rachel.
Sally, thanks, Kelly.